Nobody can say Aaron Glenn is doing a good job right now as Jets head coach, but he is not on the hot seat. And we are a long way away from saying he should be one and done with this team. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, October 8th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. On today's show, we are going to grade Justin Fields' performance. We're going to talk about issues that pop up over and over when the Jets hire a new head coach. We're going to talk about why Aaron Glenn should not be on the hot seat and why he should be a long way from any sort of discussion about being one and done. It's our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday, we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin. First question, John, I know you've been pretty vocal that Glenn should not be fired after his first season, but look at the performance. At some point, the Jets may have to consider making a coaching change after this year if things don't improve. Am I right? Yeah, I've been pretty vocal about this. The question is correct. Now, the one thing I will say is this week, I've said for the first time, I think the odds are above zero because the team has just looked so hopeless through the first 5 games of the season. And if you're going to make a change after 1 year, it has to be a pretty extreme scenario. It just has to be a case where a guy just looks like he's in so far over his head that there's no point in continuing. The guy has to look so far in over his head that you just know he's not a head coach. You know, at least at this point in time, he's a coordinator. But I think it needs to continue for longer than a 5-week stretch. I will say this. I mean, if there was going to be a scenario where the Jets made a coaching change after 1 year, this is how it would start. But 5 weeks is simply not enough. If you look through the history of the league, and not even distant history, if you look through the recent history, there are lots of coaches who have turned out to be pretty good who started 0-5 in their first year as a head coach. And you know, I'm hesitant to put names out there because when you do that, you're setting an expectation that Glenn is automatically going to have the same trajectory. But you know, some of the names out there who are like Kyle Shanahan, who obviously is an excellent head coach with the San Francisco 49ers. Maybe more realistically, Zach Taylor with the Bengals. I'm not sure Zach Taylor's a great head coach, but the Bengals did go to the Super Bowl with him 2 years after a first year where people were not very high on him. So one thing I'll say is that a team's performance over the first 5 games of a head coaching tenure are not really emblematic of anything. They don't really give you a great insight into how a coach is going to turn out. And there are lots of coaches who have very successful first years who end up being lousy. Adam Gase went to the playoffs his first year as a head coach. Ben McAdoo went to the playoffs his first year as a head coach. Eric Mangini went to the playoffs his first year as a head coach. None of them were ultimately successful. So I think you have to grade a coach over a long-term trajectory. And I think like sometimes, a team starts out and they look absolutely hopeless the first couple of weeks of the season under a new head coach, and then they get more competitive as the year goes on. So I think we need to see a lot more from Aaron Glenn. This is the analogy I would use. You could have a player, let's say it's a wide receiver, who has a bad couple of weeks. And you say, you know what? He's not playing well. He's got to improve. But that doesn't mean you automatically say he's got to be traded or he's got to be cut. That's kind of like the mindset I have with Aaron Glenn. When I say, he should not be one and done and he should not be on the hot seat, that's not defending the job Glenn's doing. The job Glenn's doing has to improve. There are lots of areas where the coaching has been deficient. And yeah, look, there are obviously talent issues with the team, particularly with some of the injuries they've suffered. They've got some day 3 rookies who really should not be on the field right now who are getting snaps because of injuries. And at this point, part of me feels like the Jets are making the right moves, like giving these rookies all these snaps, because if the team's going to be bad, at least get young guys out there, get them reps, see if you can develop them some. But it's not just about the personnel. I mean, the coaching, I think, has to take some of the blame, particularly for the issues on the defensive side of the ball, where there's just a total lack of cohesion. And I wrote a couple articles on GettingGreenNation.com yesterday about the plays the defense is not making. How they're just chronic issues, guys over pursuing, guys getting themselves out of position, particularly biting on play action. And when it's system wide, I think it has to be the coaching staff that takes some of the blame. If there's one player making a mistake over and over, I blame the player. If the same issues are popping up team wide, then I got to look. The players are still not performing. Players should still know better. But if things are not getting corrected and it's team wide, the coaches have to take some of the blame. So I'm not exonerating the coaching staff. In fact, I've even been vocal that I think it's only been 5 games. I think it's too early to give up on Glenn as head coach. I don't think it's too early to give up on Steve Wilks as defensive coordinator. What I'm seeing right now is a defensive scheme that seems badly outdated, a defensive scheme that's not fooling anybody, and beyond the scheme, just a total lack of fundamentals on the defensive side of the ball. Some very frustrating stuff. But part of being a good head coach in this league and part of developing as a head coach means that you have to figure out your way through the tough moments. I think every head coach has moments where they seem lost, where things seem hopeless, where it doesn't seem like anything's getting through. And the good guys recover from that. Some of the coaches I mentioned earlier, Gase, McAdoo, Mangini, and we can go on. They had a great first year. Their initial plan worked really well. But year 2, when things hit rough waters, they had no idea how to adjust. They had no idea how to work their way through the difficult times. And they never really figured it out. So I think for Glenn, unfortunately, this test has come really early in his career. I think we would have liked for it to not have happened right off the bat. I think we would have liked for Glenn to have been more successful in his early days. But it's this is where we're going to find out how good Aaron Glenn is, when you can't tell which way is up. And you have to battle your way out of it. That's where we find out the quality of a head coach. And I know nobody wants to hear this, but if we're going to be honest, when you hire a first-time head coach, there are going to be growing pains. Aaron Glenn's still learning how to do the job. And if you didn't want a coach who was going to go through growing pains, you should have hired somebody more experienced. And, in a bit, we're going to talk about some of the Jets' tendencies when they hire head coaches and how maybe going with experience might not be the worst thing in the world, but Glenn's still trying to figure things out. And there's one other element to this, and this is another one I know people don't want to hear, but this job is, if the Jets fired Aaron Glenn after this year, this job would not be an easy sell. I mean, head coaches all have different things that they prioritize, but I don't think the Jets really have anything that would attract a head coach. I mean, the number one thing a lot of people look for is stable ownership. If I go through a rough patch, will the owner stick by me? Well, in this case, let's say in a hypothetical where the Jets have fired Glenn, well, they didn't stick through a first-year head coach who went through tough times. The year before, they didn't stick with a head coach who got off to a rough first 5 games because they fired Robert Saleh after 5 games. You're not really going to have a great choice of options at that point. I mean, somebody will take the job, but you have to remember this job was not attractive this year. Glenn was a hot coordinator candidate, and he was probably the only one who was interested in the Jets in a serious way. And the reason for that was he was a player here. He loves the Jets. I don't know that there's going to be another guy out there who's a hot candidate who's going to be really that interested in the job. The one caveat, and I almost shouldn't even say this because I don't think it's going to happen, but the one caveat is if there was like a legitimate elite coach who was available and the Jets could throw a lot of money at him, that's the point where you say, okay, sorry, Glenn, we just had an opportunity. I doubt the Ravens are firing John Harbaugh even after their rough start. If John Harbaugh got fired, the Jets 100% should make back channel contact with him to see whether he'd take a huge dollar amount. He'd come if the Jets paid him a ton of money. But that requires savvy. It requires back channel negotiations. It requires competence. None of these things Woody Johnson has. So, I think that most likely, unless this season just doesn't get any better, unless this team shows zero improvement, unless this team has one of those disaster seasons where they finish 0-17 or something, which probably not going to happen, I don't think we're even close to the point where we're talking about firing Glenn this year. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about Jets' broader tendencies because Aaron Glenn checks a lot of boxes that are common for Jets coaching hires. And maybe the Jets should rethink the way they hire coaches. We'll discuss as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season has arrived, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Because right now, new customers can bet just $5 to get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. FanDuel gives you so many ways to play. You can build parlays, you can try player props, you can even follow the live lines during games. It makes watching football more exciting when you got a little something riding on the action. Whether you're a casual fan or love diving into the stats, FanDuel makes the game day experience so much better. So let's dive in to this weekend. Jets are in London against the Denver Broncos. Technically a Jets home game, even though it's really a neutral site game. And the Jets are 7-point underdogs against the Broncos. Now, that sounds about right for the way the Jets have played so far. You want to get in on the action, though, FanDuel's the place to do it. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. Again, it's FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question comes from Don, who writes, why does Aaron Glenn say it will take time and then ask for patience? When you look at the Bears, Jaguars, and Patriots, the Jets' talent level is on par with them, and they've righted the ship. Is it organizational? It seems like the Jets hire the top candidate each time and they fail. Which one is it? These questions have complex answers, Don. First of all, I think it's a little early to say that the Bears, Patriots, and Jaguars have righted the ship. I mean, we are only 5 weeks into the season. What I would say is that those teams are playing at a higher level than the Jets. Are their talent levels equal to the Jets? I think that's debatable, but I think there's no question the new coaches in those organizations have gotten more out of their teams than Aaron Glenn's gotten out of the Jets. I think that it is true. It will take time for the Jets to turn it around in terms of getting this team to a winning place, in terms of getting the team to the playoffs, having a winning record. I don't love Glenn saying that it's going to take patience, though, in response to the performance we saw Sunday against Dallas or the performance 2 weeks ago against Miami. I think that Jets coaches through the years have had the tendency to just try and explain everything away, everything bad away as well. We're rebuilding. And I think it's a convenient excuse. I don't like hearing that from Glenn because, yes, rebuilding is an excuse for, your team not having a winning record. Rebuilding is an excuse for your team missing the playoffs. Rebuilding is not an excuse for your team looking completely inept against the Dallas Cowboys. I don't like that answer from Glenn. I'm going to be honest with you. And I think I've seen this over and over with the Jets, where it's just a blanket excuse. It's very convenient to blame rebuilding when you're a coach for a bad performance, but it's not always about rebuilding. Again, so this goes back to something I said in the first segment. There's a difference between saying Glenn's doing a good job and Glenn's got to go. I don't think Glenn's got to go yet. I think Glenn's got to do a better job. And I think the excuses need to stop. But as far as, the coaches the Jets end up with, I don't think the Jets always end up with the top candidates in each cycle. I think it's been very rare the Jets have ended up with the top candidates. The only time when we're talking about head coach or GM hires the Jets have made in recent memory, there was only one that seemed like a grand slam at the time that was received universal praise in the media, and that was when the Jets hired Joe Douglas as their GM. As we know, that didn't really work out. Jets have a tendency, though. If you look at Woody and Chris Johnson, they've hired 7 head coaches. 6 of them are first-time head coaches. A lot of people also note that 6 of them first-time head coaches with a defensive background. I don't think the defensive background matters as much because you look across the league. I mean, there's this perception that it's better to hire a coach with an offensive background. You look at the actual results. I mean, there are lots of coaches with offensive backgrounds who fail. There are lots of coaches with defensive or special teams backgrounds who are successful. I think there are lots of different styles of head coach that can work. You can have a guy who comes in as an offensive guru who calls the plays, and he can be successful or he can fail. You can have a guy with a defensive background who's more of a CEO style head coach, and he can be successful or he can fail. The issue with the Jets, though, is that, you have ownership who just is not good at picking a coach and supporting a coach. How many times do the Jets pick the wrong coach who's a first timer? Well, if you can't pick a good coach, why don't you go with somebody who's experienced? The only head coach the Jets have hired in the Johnson era who had experience as a head coach was Adam Gase, which was a joke of a hire. So I think that's an open question why the Jets don't get somebody with experience, because they stink at picking head coaches. And, it kind of makes me laugh when people say, well, Woody Johnson wouldn't get so much criticism if he was better at picking coaches. Well, it's like saying Zach Wilson wouldn't get so much criticism if he threw more accurate passes. It's the most important thing an owner does. It's like essential to the job. There's nothing more important that the owner does than hiring the people to run his team. There are other things that matter, but like it's it's like Brandon Stevens wouldn't get so much criticism if he wasn't constantly burned in coverage. That's the biggest thing they have to do, and they fail at it over and over. But I also think of it in this context. When a team drafts a quarterback, and we've seen this over and over with the Jets, you always hear about how you have to create a situation that will help his development. The word development is used over and over. We have to get a good offensive line. We have to get a good coaching staff in here to train him. We got to get him quality receivers. And it's true. You look across the league. I mean, look at all the quarterbacks right now who failed in the first stop. And some of them who failed in the first stop when that stop was Sam Darnold with the Jets, Geno Smith with the Jets, and they've gone on and been successful in other places where teams have put them in better situations. Jets threw these guys out, bad offensive lines, bad coaching staffs, bad receiver groups. It helps think a young quarterback. We don't think of young coaches in the same way. We don't think of first-time head coaches in the same mindset, but it's really true. I mean, when the Pittsburgh Steelers hired Mike Tomlin back in 2007, he was 34, 35 years old. They had a stable organization around him. They had a good front office. They had some coaches from Bill Cowher's staff who they could retain, who would help guide him along his way. If Mike Tomlin was hired in a different organization in 2007, I'm not sure he would have gone on to be as successful. And then through the years, just as a quarterback develops and the quarterback starts to learn, and you can take the training wheels off a quarterback, and the quarterback becomes the focal point of the offense. Mike Tomlin's become a great coach. The Jets never have this infrastructure in place to develop young coaches, to bring them along. So I think that we'll see how Glenn turns out. I'm hoping Glenn ends up being the exception to the rule, but if you want to know why the Jets fail so often with these coaching hires, I mean, first of all, it's because the owners don't know how to pick a coach, and yet they always insist on going with these first timers. And second is they never have a stable organization to help develop these first time coaches. I think that's a big failure for this Jets team. And I think that's a big problem. Next question. So far this season, the Jets defense has been pretty bad. Do you think the 2026 draft is deep enough to provide 2 or 3 talented players at all 3 levels of the defense to correct the issues the Jets defense has? Well, the early consensus seems to be that this is not a great draft class, but I don't think that's an excuse. I mean, that's why you have scouts. One of the things that always makes me laugh is that when the consensus is that the draft class is bad, you always hear these like anonymous quotes in the media before the draft saying like, well, you can't expect your team to do that well this year. It's like preemptive excuse making. In a deep class, everybody should be able to find good players. The classes that are thin, that's when you find out who the good scouts are. I remember the COVID year, which, threw everything into chaos because, the normal scouting process got completely, thrown off course. People said, well, it's really tough to judge a front office on how they do this year. I think the COVID year is a year where you judge front offices more because the normal playbook's out there. You actually have to think creatively. You have to think critically. You have to come up with your own template. The normal NFL playbook doesn't work anymore. So I think the answer is it doesn't matter how deep the class is. The Jets need to be able to scout guys. The Jets need to be able to find good players for their system. So I don't, the perception at least in the early stages, and you have to remember we're in early October right now, so there's still a long way to go in the college season, lots of opportunities for players to step up. But the early consensus seems to be that the draft class this year is not particularly great, but I don't view that as an excuse. I think that the Jets need to be able to scout players. I think they need to be able to find effective guys. I just think that's the way it is. Next question's from Michael. Given the horrendous start, many are comparing this year's Jets squad to the 96 squad who finished 1-15 under Rich Kotite. I watched that year with much frustration. I'd be interested in your take regarding a comparison of this year's players to that year's squad. And I think Michael asked me to do a position-by-position grouping. I think going position by position might not be the best way to compare these guys because the NFL of 96 is different from the NFL of today. In 96, the Jets hired Ron Earhart as their offensive coordinator from the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Earhart, in Pittsburgh during his time with the Steelers before he came to the Jets, came up with something that was kind of revolutionary, along with Pittsburgh's then wide receivers coach, who ended up being a future Jets offensive coordinator, Chan Gailey. Earhart and Gailey started spreading the field with wide receivers on passing downs on like 3rd and 4th downs. In the 90s, that was like revolutionary. In today's NFL, it's like a staple of every NFL, of every offense. So the game's just really different. The 96 team was better. The 96 team won 9 games the next year and almost made the playoffs with Bill Parcells. The 96 team, the only issue was coaching. And although there were changes between 97 and 98, a lot of the core of the 96 team went to the AFC Championship game 2 years later under Bill Parcells when the Jets went 12-4 in 1998. The 96 team was a good team. It had a good roster. It just had ridiculous coaching, unbelievably bad coaching with Rich Kotite. This year's Jets team is not as talented. This year's Jets team has glaring holes. The issue with this year's Jets team is, like the 96 team, they just even when they're in a game situation that really is in their favor, when really leans in their way, even when this team like the 96 team, the other team's in 3rd and 15. It doesn't matter what your talent level is. If you're on defense and the other team's offense is in 3rd and 15, you should be able to get off the field. This year's Jets defense, even when they have the other offense on 3rd and 15, they have a tough time getting off the field. But the talent level is much higher. I mean, this year's Jets team has holes in the number 2 receiver. You want to talk about the defensive side of the ball, and there's no depth. So this year's Jets team is not as talented as the 96 team, but they play a similar brand of really bad football. And that's the frustration. I don't think I've seen a Jets team make more self-inflicted errors than any team since the 96 team. That's where my frustration comes in. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk Justin Fields' performance. Got a question coming up. Am I being a little bit too hard on Fields given the difficulties he's got? I don't think I am. I'll explain why as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets.
I'm Cody Rourke from Locked On Broncos, and this episode is brought to you by Peloton. Peloton is shaping the future of fitness with the brand new Peloton Cross-Training Tread Plus, powered by Peloton IQ. This is Peloton's most advanced equipment yet, giving you real-time guidance and endless ways to move, whether you're running, lifting, or you're cross-training with your favorite instructors like Alex Toussaint. It's training reimagined to make your workout more personal. Peloton is built for breakthroughs with features that help you plan, stay motivated, and hit peak performance. You can let yourself run, lift, flex, and go while Peloton handles all the rest. Plus, Peloton IQ provides real-time strength coaching, tracking your progress and suggesting weights that challenge you so you can get stronger. Plus, the new movement tracking camera, it counts your reps and corrects your form in real time, making sure every rep is safer and smarter. So let yourself run, lift, flex, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton Cross-Training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. Next question, John. I've been a big fan of your podcast since the beginning and mostly agree with your takes, but I think you've been overly critical of Justin Fields. It's undeniable that his presence has improved the running game greatly, and he's done a good job limiting turnovers. He may not be the greatest passer in the world, but he's also playing behind a very young offensive line and is incredibly short on weapons aside from Garrett. His defense also never gives too many short fields from turnovers. Grading on a curve of Jets quarterbacks of the last 25 years, I think he's somewhat effective. Don't you think the Jets could have won some games this year with this version of Fields if the defense was actually a plus instead of a negative? Look, yes, the Jets could have won week 1 against Pittsburgh, but I think if we're grading Fields' performance to date, it has not been good enough. I'm not going to grade on I don't agree with grading on the curve compared to with other Jets quarterbacks of the last 25 years, because you can be better than a Jets quarterback for the last 25 years and still not be good enough. And I think that's been the case with Fields. I think the frustration with Fields is that he always shows you enough to entice you, but there's never enough consistency. I mean, he started 4 games. The game against Buffalo was brutal. He gave the Jets no chance of winning. Game against Dallas was not good enough. I mean, he produced nothing until the game was out of hand and the Cowboys went to prevents. I mean, that's 2 starts on 4 games where I feel like he didn't give you a chance to win. And I'm not saying the pieces around Fields are perfect, but I saw the Dallas game. I saw a lot of plays that were messed up because of Fields. I mean, there was one deep ball where Garrett Wilson had a step. He got behind the defense and he missed. It would have been a big play. A couple of the sacks he took were just based on holding the ball too long. I see him missing a lot of reads, when you go back and watch the film. And, heading into the season, I wasn't hoping for perfect quarterback play from Justin Fields, but what I wanted to see him was some growth as a passer. He was not going to be a guy who was going to be like the perfect pocket passer, but I wanted to see a guy who was better than he was in Chicago. At this point, you're seeing a lot of the same stuff you saw in Chicago. Enough to entice you, enough to make you believe that This guy just puts the pieces together. He could be special. There's high-end play there. But the problem is that the low is really low. And when Justin Fields is off, he really doesn't give you much of a chance to win games. And look, the defense was awful against Dallas. I know that. But I don't think the offense was good enough to win either. I think the Jets failed on both sides of the ball in that game. And we're talking 4 starts. I've got 2 games where Fields hasn't been good enough to win. That's just too many. You can't be, as a quarterback, give your team no chance to win through half the games. Now, I'm not saying bench Fields. We know this team's not going anywhere with Tyrod Taylor playing quarterback. So Fields is going to get more opportunities. I just want to see more consistency from him. I don't think we've gotten that so far. I think that it's been a really frustrating aspect of the season so far that Fields has not taken a step forward. Next question is from Charlie. On defense, to what extent do you think the Jets' issue is ramming their system in no matter the personnel versus adapting the system to the talent pool that they have? Personally, I think adapting your system to the talent you have is always the better approach, and it concerns me when this new regime does not seem to see it that way. I think this problem is the scheme's just not any good. Nathaniel Hackett's scheme was just a bad scheme. Adam Gase's scheme was just a bad scheme. I look at the Jets, they're telegraphing blitzes. They have guys that don't play with fundamentals. There are plays where they're not even I've seen a number of plays where they don't have a defender to cover every receiver. So I just think the scheme Steve Wilks has is not any good. And my hope is that it's Steve Wilks. My fear is that maybe it's just Aaron Glenn's scheme that's the issue, and Steve Wilks is just kind of like the guy that's implementing a scheme that doesn't work, that comes from the top. I think as far as Charlie's broader question goes, there's always a balance of running your scheme versus adapting to your talent. In theory, it makes sense to adapt to your talent, but it's not always as easy in practice because you need to have players who can run a cohesive scheme. If you have one offensive lineman who's really good at gap blocking in the run game and another who's really good at zone blocking, what do you do then? If you have one corner who's great in man coverage, the other who's great in zone coverage, well, what's the scheme for that? I think having a scheme is helpful from the standpoint it tells you the types of players you want. It helps you zero in on the types of players you should be targeting. If you're going to run a man defense, then you look for corners who fit a man defense. If you're going to run a zone blocking scheme on offense in the run game, you look for offensive linemen who can zone block. I think another issue is just a lot of coaches have big knowledge gaps. They've typically come up, they've learned the nuances of one particular system. And you have to really know a system well to be able to implement it. I mean, you go back to the 60s, there's stories of Vince Lombardi holding a lecture, and he talked for 5 hours about his sweep play, which was the staple play of the Packers in that era, because he knew the intricacies inside and out, so he could teach it. Most coaches don't know a lot of most coaches in the NFL, they know their system, but they don't know another system well enough to implement it. So it's easier said than done, I think. I think that was always one of the advantages Bill Belichick had with New England, is that he knew so much about the history of football that he knew the nuances of pretty much any scheme. So he was able to adapt his scheme. Another part of this is Aaron Glenn said something over the course of the offseason that was really smart. He said, to be a great coach, you have to be a great scout. Now, unfortunately, the Jets coaches right now don't look like great coaches or great scouts. But I think what Glenn meant by that is you have to understand what your players do well and what they don't do well. A lot of coaches aren't very good at figuring that out, because if you can figure out what a player does well and what a player doesn't do well, then you figure out how to put him in situations where his talent shines and keep him out of situations where he's going to struggle. But this is all easier said than done. I think I agree that in an ideal world, you'd be able to adapt your system to your player skills. But I do think that's easier in practice than it is in reality. And our last question from Taylor. John, I recently heard a story about a prominent Carolina Panthers podcast that ended its show on the grounds the team was no longer worth the time and effort in covering. You're not having similar dark thoughts, are you? In all seriousness, I've been a Jets fan for over 30 years now, and I've never been as demoralized as I am this year. Do you have any words of comfort that you can give us to convince Jets fans to keep going? Well, I mean, I don't know if the Jets are worth covering now. I don't know if they're worth the time and effort now, and I'm still covering them. So I don't know if that'll put you at ease, Taylor. But I mean, if I heard about that Panthers podcast that ended because they didn't think the team was worth covering. I mean, I don't think the Jets are worth covering at the moment, and I'm still here every day. So, but I don't want to sit here and tell you, Garen, make promises that I can't keep, that things are going to get better, because I've been doing this show since 2016. and things haven't gotten better. All I can do is offer you like the roadmap to maybe this will get better here or there. And the one thing I will say is, it's tough to stay this bad for this long in the NFL, even if you're doing all the wrong things. Eventually, like some year, you'll run into an easy schedule, you'll have the right mix of players, and maybe something good will happen. So, outside of that, things can change in the NFL. The Giants were at their darkest moment before they brought in George Young and Bill Parcells in the late 70s, early 80s. They were every bit as dysfunctional as the Jets are now. Now, that took the league stepping in and forcing them to hire a GM, George Young, who ended up building a great team. It also required a coach, Ray Perkins, quitting to go to Alabama, and then that leading to the promotion of Parcells. But things can turn around. The New Orleans Saints in their entire franchise history had one playoff win before they hired Sean Payton and signed Drew Brees. Washington Commanders, you saw how dysfunctional they were. Now, that took a new owner, and I think a new owner here would fix a lot of things. But they went from being one of the most dysfunctional franchises in the NFL for decades to in the NFC Championship game in the span of a year. Again, new owner helped with that. But even a few years back, the Houston Texans were the most dysfunctional team in the league. There was a stretch of the Texans were more dysfunctional than the Jets, and they ended up turning it around and winning a couple AFC South titles in short order. Now, you may look at this and say, well, this has happened since in all this time, the Jets have stayed terrible. Well, I guess at some point things can turn around in the NFL. That's really all I got. I don't want to sit here and promise you things are going to get better because we need to see proof of that. But things can get better. Sometimes things seem hopeless in the NFL. And then suddenly like that, things can be terrible for a long time. Then just like that, they can turn around. I hope that helps. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you don't miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll do crossover Thursday with Locked On Broncos.